Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Frida, one of our organizers here, will start with saying a couple of words about the technical side of things and the recording side of things, and then I will say very briefly a couple of words about Demos, our research group today, and our event and our speaker, and then we get straight away into the lecture. Frida?
Yes. Microphone.
Yeah, I cannot hear you, but maybe it's okay.
Maybe now it will work for just a second. So, hello, everyone. My name is Frida. No, your audio. One second. Okay, there we go. Now it works. Hello, yes, this is your casual GDPR announcement. For legal reasons in Denmark, we have to do this. So this meeting is going to be recorded in terms of the audio and the screens, and we plan to put this on our social media handles. So this is your chance to call out if you don't want to be recorded in regards of your voice or your camera. Then you should let us know. You can, of course, keep your camera off, and you can, of course, post all your questions digitally. But if you want to have your camera on and if you want to speak out your questions, you can do so. But please send a message in the chat that you would like to be edited out. That way I can blur your voice and I can blur your camera before we publish this. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Frida. Welcome, everyone. My name is Franz Bernhard from Demos, and I will briefly start with introducing our research group today and today's topic, as well as our invited speaker before we start the lecture. We are here at Demos, our research group at Aalborg University in Denmark. It's short for Democracy, Migration, and Society. And we focus on the study of democracy from a critical and interdisciplinary perspective. So in this regard, it's important to us to understand democracy in relation to other areas which entail very transformative practices and social and political change as well. And from this critical perspective, in our research group's reading club, we arrived at a range of questions considering the very strong right-wing populist and ethno-nationalist wave we're seeing in Europe and the US right now. And we started asking questions and became more and more interested in exploring further where the political forces on the left stand with regards to what we would call broader the nation or the national question. So can the arguably ambivalent and heavily charged notion of nationalism, which is obviously and famously often grounded in and intersecting with colonial and racialized framings, even productively intersect with more emancipatory struggles in other social fields? Or should we work to conceptualize beyond nationalism, both politically as well as scholarly, with regards to elements like methodological nationalism and so on? And with these thoughts in mind, I'm really honored to introduce the author whose work we chose subsequently to read in our reading club in order to explore this, Dr. Rosa Burç, and her work on the Kurdish left and its quest for democracy, which is also the title of today's talk. Dr. Rosa Burç is a political sociologist who works as a research associate at the German National Center for Integration and Migration Research, DeZIM, short and in German, and as part of the German National Monitoring of Discrimination and Racism and the Migration Department in Berlin. She finished, congrats by the way, her PhD at the Center on Social Movement Studies at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence in Italy. And she specializes in transnational orders of violence, mobilization and conflict, and political imaginaries of unprotected and stateless communities. And in her great and wide-ranging and interesting work and case studies, she focused specifically on Kurdish transnational mobilization, which made it really for our reading club and what I mentioned before on the national question so interesting for us, as she defines the left-wing politics of Kurdish mobilization as a multi-directional resistance rather than a straightforward, so to speak, conventional national liberation movement. So with these thoughts in mind, and without further delay, because you're obviously all here to hear her talk, we will start Rosa's talk and lecture. If you can think of questions in the meantime, you can already write them into the chat. We will have a question and answer session after the talk. So if you can think of questions already, feel free to post them into the chat, and then we will get to them first. But you can also obviously then during the Q&A raise your hand, and we will get to you, and you will be able to pose your questions. So yeah, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Rosa Burç.
Thank you, Franz. Oh, I can hear my voice. So, okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this session that you have, and also it's an honor to hear that you were reading some of the readings and the articles that I have been writing in the past years. And I mean, on Kurdish mobilization in times of violence, I keep adding that extra always in times of violence, and I will come to that later. So I think you are already somehow familiar with the main arguments that I try to put in the debate on emancipatory movements beyond ethno-nationalist rigid frames, let's say. So I see this lecture, I was told I would have like an hour, about an hour. I don't think I will talk so long, but maybe you never know. So I see this lecture more or less as an input. So like a beginning of like a Q&A later, a conversation that we can have. And I will try to also address some other like let's say trajectories of thinking about that, not only like in terms of outcomes, what kind of movement is the Kurdish movement, but more how to actually also methodologically approach this kind of let's say research question, or how to actually move in the field as a researcher. But I mean, this is something that we can also discuss later. So whenever you feel like you would like to know more about one of the aspects that I kind of mention, or that I don't go too much in depth, please write them down. Let's talk about that later, because I mean, the Kurdish issue, if we can say it like that, is such a broad issue. It entails 4 nation states, a long history of multiple violent episodes of, I would even say continuous genocidal oppression against Kurdish populations across not only the region, Middle East, but also going way beyond the region, also in terms of when we look at how Kurdish communities are criminalized in, for instance, the UK or Europe or Germany. So we have like a very long and very complicated subject matter at hand. So please bear with me if I'm not touching upon, all aspects. I will try to have a bit of a focus here. So the event, as you already said, is titled Kurdish Left and its Quest for Democracy. And I already mentioned that I do always add, mobilization in times of violence. And I think the question for alternative quests, alternative conceptualizations of freedom, democracy, nation, nationality, always also necessitates an analysis of the state of violence within where these ideas and practices are actually developing. So without the context, in a way, we cannot really understand why certain movements or protest forms actually address certain topics and not others, or form or shape their repertoires in a certain way. So my talk today, therefore, will be structured along the question of violence and how it is perceived, memorized, and internalized by Kurdish activists on the left, and eventually to then have a better understanding how this has an impact on the ideational and practical, repertoires of resistance, the emancipatory frameworks that go beyond ethno-nationalist claims. So Kurdish mobilization, however, not only unfolds in times of violence, but also, as I already mentioned, across national borders in a translocal and transnational manner. So although, we speak about transnational mobilization, there is always, you will also know when you engage with the topic, there is always a focus on Turkey. I mean, even in the way we narrate a history of Kurdistan, we always start somehow in the imaginary of, a Turkish nation state to then go the next step and to say, okay, so in relation to Turkey, there is this issue, or in relation to Turkey, there is this population. And I find it also very problematic. However, in terms of operationalizing this transnational mobilization of Kurdish movements and Kurdish activists, and when I say transnational, I literally mean even moments of protest where Kurdish populations would actually walk from one side of the border to the other side of the border in order to kind of join the resistance on the other side of the border, which is only another part of Kurdistan. So transnational mobilization is a very physical thing also. It's not just an imaginary or like an imagined territory. It's actually a very physical, active, sometimes even practice. However, as I said, in order to operationalize it, I tried in my work actually to kind of justify why I keep going back to Turkey. And Fiona Adamson's work on translocality and assemblage theory, like conflict assemblage, kind of helped me to understand the field when we look at Kurdish mobilization or Kurdish alternative quests. And so basically what she calls it, in fact, based on, she says that it's PKK Turkey conflict, so we can say a PKK centric conflict assemblage in order to find, the multiple localities where this conflict takes place. So I kind of borrowed her conceptualization. However, I changed it in my work and I said it's actually a Turkey-centric conflict assemblage because Turkey is very much intervening into the in actually all the societal developments across its borders, inside, etc. So the conflict is not there because we have an armed struggle, but the conflict is there because Turkey is producing violent orders inside and outside its borders. So taking this like as a starting point, that we have a Turkey-centric conflict assemblage, just to keep that in mind, I just wanted to add that here. But wrapping up like 100 years, I mean, Turkey is a nation state almost like now for 100 years. And wrapping up 100 years of state violence and modes of authoritarianism would completely exceed the purpose of this talk. But however, I still want to give you a glimpse on the state-society relations in Turkey and, more specifically, how the Turkish state approaches the Kurdish question, so-called Kurdish question, and also to understand the necropolitical order inherent to it, and then to look at the mobilization. So one of the main arguments of this talk, I think, is that one of the core notions that is relevant to understand the Kurdish quest for democracy, I argue, is a sphere of contention between, quote unquote, becoming a Kurdish subject as a form of resistance amid assimilation as politics and state-led, making of a particular state-loyal Kurdish subjectivity. But I will get into that later. So I will try to kind of unpack, and please, whenever you have a question, please just write them down and we will address them. But how the category of Kurdish subjectivity or like Kurdish identity within the left, what it actually means and what role and concepts such as democratic nation have been developing out of a reconceptualization of national belonging. But first, let's shed a bit more light on authoritarianism in Turkey. As I said, context really matters, and also violence really matters. So since 2015, much has been written on the rise of authoritarianism in Erdogan's Turkey. The authoritarian shift has already manifested itself during the Gezi Park protests in 2013, and then it was strengthened by successive electoral putches after the AKP lost its absolute majority in June 2015 general elections. And then after that, there was a controlled coup in 2016, a permanent emergency, successive nationalist coalitions to, quote unquote, protect the state from external and internal enemies, the remaking of the constitution, the imprisonment of Kurdish political actors, elected mayors, elected politicians, party co-chairs, arbitrary arrests across the board, several military operations in northern Syria, Rojava, the building of military bases, the expansion of military bases in Iraq, northern Iraq and Bashur Kurdistan, the regressive developments of gender equality, freedom of thought and press, and finally, all of this culminating in also a very, actually a recent electoral outcome, 1 or 2 years ago in favor of the AKP again. And with all of that, a consolidation of authoritarian majorities, including also secularist oppositional segments in the country. So in terms of, the nationalist, or let's say right-wing populist wave that we are witnessing in the world, this was like Turkey's share in that history making, let's say. And political historian Hamid Bozarslan has described this authoritarian development in the recent years as, he calls it dynamics of brutalization. And he says that the regime under Erdogan actually follows the purpose of, quote, a nation turned into one man. So it's a new, nationalizing narrative, let's say. So although the history of the authoritarianism in Turkey is like 100 years old or longer, if you count in Ottoman Empire, but there is a significant shift in how authoritarianism is actually realized under the AKP. So regime change under Erdogan has been variously defined by scholars. Some call it a second foundation, such as Professor Banu Bargu. Some call it competitive authoritarianism, some like Berk Esen, and some call it New Turkey. Nikos Christofis, Mahir Tokatlı calls it presidentialism a la Turca, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many attempts at conceptualizing authoritarianism in Turkey. However, I think if we want to understand Erdoganism, in Bozarslan's words, we must also think of the past years of authoritarianism in Turkey as, he actually says it, as a war against the cognitive faculties of a society that only anchors itself by provoking, and I think this is the important part, by provoking new cycles of new crises to every time consolidate a homogeneous narration of the nation state. And these crises that are created and weaponized by the government not only consolidate a homogeneous, conceptualization of the nation state, but also always ignite a racist hypermobilization against Kurds and their sites of political and cultural articulation. So we also have not only violence coming from the state, but also violence that is experienced in more racialized societal relations within the Turkey's society, let's say. So I don't want to talk about the so-called Kurdish question as an issue of a minority, a security issue, or a problem of a particular region with demarcated, coordinates. But I argue that through the ways the so-called Kurdish issue has been approached by the Turkish state and its governments, power and national sovereignty has always been re-established in, as I said, times of crisis. But more importantly, the hegemonic nationalist bloc has always been consolidated. So, and within that hegemonic bloc, we also have the secularist, nationalist segments of the Turkish society. So I think if we think of the Kurdish issues like as a dynamic process of state-society relations, we can maybe avoid some pitfalls such as essentialist approaches to what kind of articulations have been, growing out of that unfree situation. And something that is also, I think, quite important is if we compare the Kurdish contemporary mobilization in Turkey and also in Rojava or in Europe, transnationally, we see that it is a deviant case to, other trajectories of other uprisings in the region, such as the Arab Spring. And scholarship has often focused on, I come from social movement studies, so there has been a very clear focus on the after effects of, let's say, failed revolutionary episodes with nation states, or focusing on narratives of despair, disillusionment, with a focus on former activists. But in the Kurdish case, we have a divergent and a different temporality in the region. And this kind of challenges some dominant tools of analysis through which anti-colonial and revolutionary movements have been assessed so far. And so far, most of the tools that we have methodologically speaking have been the categories of ethno-nationalism or nationalizing discourses of liberation. And I think in your introduction, you already mentioned that. And for instance, looking across the border, now away from Turkey towards Syria, we see that currently, maybe this is something we can delve into a bit more in the Q&A, but in post-Assad Syria, we have two narratives too, like in the imaginary of how to build a society and a nation, how to construct, a nation for all. We see in the Syrian case a momentum where that is renegotiated at the moment, and we have on the one side the Syrian national identity being reconstructed and re-narrated as a homogeneously Syrian and Arab, nation, a free nation, without a place for a Kurdish imaginary included, actually. So, and even, not even like, I would even, yeah. So on the other side, in the country, we have Rojava pushing a notion of democratic nation, pushing a notion of, a grassroots democracy where different segments of society are included, a very inclusionist thinking of how to construct the category of nation, where ethnicity and nationality are actually decentered. And that is not anymore one of the main issues at the table, but different kinds of subjugation and different kinds of processes of oppression. And I would even go further that the Rojava case, and we can talk about it a bit later maybe, but it's not even decentering ethnicity and nationality, but also to some degree even territoriality. So this is really interesting. So on the one side, we have a trajectory of a revolutionary narrative that actually goes back to the nationalist categories of liberation. And on the other hand, we have like a different trajectory of Kurdish mobilization accumulating in the Rojava example that actually decenters all of those ethno-nationalist categories that we usually know within the, I call it the homogeneity paradigm of national and territorial sovereignty. I think this is what I call in my thesis. And I think this all has to do with how movements narrate emancipation and emancipatory futures, and how freedom in a post-authoritarian context is imagined by some. And as I said in the beginning, I believe that this always has to do with how activists within the left are actually embedded in certain contexts, and how they perceive, memorize, and how they also effectively build a relation to the violent context in which they live in. And in my work, I have kind of argued, and I think also my case studies, I did field work in different sites, but also mostly remotely. But I was in Mahmur camp in southern Kurdistan. I have been conducting interviews with imprisoned politicians from the Kurdish party in Turkey with written letters. I have conducted interviews with AZD minoritized communities within the Kurdish imaginary in Germany. So I have a very, let's say, diverse sample of activists who work or who kind of devote their lives to Kurdish mobilization. And what was very interesting is that all of them, in fact, perceived violence in Kurdistan not as a periodic thing. It was very much perceived as, or not even just limited to the confines of a nation state. So in the narratives, and when I asked them questions about their life histories, it was always narrated as an enduring condition inscribed into the daily lives, and of being kind of desubjectivized and of being colonized as a society. Or even borrowing from Professor Goner, Özlem Goner's work, where mobilization in the narratives was not merely signified as, she calls it, quote unquote, resistances against state violence, but struggles that are built in and through violence. And I think this really shifts the notion of how violence is perceived and what kind of antitheses are developed to overcome violence. So the question never was, during the interviews, never was that my interlocutors were activists who would claim something from the state or who would seek for opportunity structures, like in social movement studies, or who would have actually, what I found super interesting, notions of defeat and victory after episodes. So there was no episodic notion of resistance and oppression, but rather, so basically I shifted the focus on, away from these questions, and I tried to understand how a movement like the Kurdish movement, the transnational mobilization, manages to sustain itself and its emancipatory aspirations over time, and despite violence on the one hand, and on the other hand, I tried to look precisely into the notion of statelessness as embedded within the coloniality of Kurdistan, but not as a lack of a Kurdish state, but in how the nationalizing hegemonic discourse produce subjects of non-belonging in Kurdistan, which then translates in the language of my interlocutors as we are stateless. Because one thing that was really interesting to me was all of those activists I interviewed, they are activists for a non-state seeking movement. So they say, we are part of the Kurdish movement, they are supportive and they're advocates of democratic confederalism, democratic nation, democratic autonomy, where everything is decentered, as I already mentioned. However, at the same time, in the way they would frame their grievances and their aspirations, statelessness remained, a term that was used. And I tried to understand what it means that they are referring to when they say we are stateless, because most of the activists that I spoke to had citizenships, they had passports, and they were not even advocating for nationalist liberation. So, and they would not say a Kurdish state will bring us freedom. So how come statelessness remained a big topic? So this was one of the main motivations for me to dig in, to try to understand more what it means. And one of my interlocutors actually, when I asked him, and he's a former politician in exile in Germany now, and when I asked him what motivated him to continue being, engaged in politics despite the heavy degree of violence and oppression, he said, quote unquote, being Kurdish is like not being the the subject of your own life. It is when every aspect of your life is externally determined. This is what we want to change. We want to be subjects in our own lives. So it was not about, being a member of a nation. It was more about being subject in your own life. So it was more about, becoming a subject. So which already kind of pushed me towards problematizing categories like statelessness. And maybe you also remember in 16, or maybe, no, sorry, even 2015. I'm sorry, I have to check. But the chair of the Diyarbakir Bar Association, Tahir Elchi, was assassinated. And he basically gave a speech in order to stop the urban warfare, and he was calling out for peace, etc. And he was assassinated while he was giving a live broadcasted speech. And the funeral march in Diyarbakir was very moving. And if you ask me when my quest for researching Kurdish mobilization started, was maybe that funeral march, because back then one of the today imprisoned co-chair, Selahattin Demirtas, he gave a speech, and in that speech he said, not the state killed Tahir Elchi, but statelessness. So again, statelessness was again framed as something that really was the core of unfreedom. So I found the quote very interesting, because it was made at a time where the political movement in Turkey that Demirtas was representing clearly stated that they were not interested in forming a Kurdish national state, that they were engaging in building a democratic joint republic in Turkey. But he brought back the notion of being stateless. So I wondered, what does it mean, and why are states and statelessness have such a prominent place in the emotional landscapes of Kurdish activists? And in the literature, statelessness in the Kurdish case, and I will lead to how this has something to do with the concepts of nation and nationality and belonging. But in the literature, statelessness is often described for the Kurds as a double deprivation, meaning the deprivation of state, so the lack of a Kurdish state, but also the deprivation of self-determination. And however, with critical sociology in the field of statelessness, there are some critical approaches. They really want to move beyond the attention of they want to put the attention away from legalist framings, and they want to challenge the underlying hegemonic assumption in those framings that the state is actually an emancipatory actor, and where the existence of statelessness rests. So if you kind of have a state, you don't have a problem with statelessness anymore, right? But in the case of the Kurds, this was always a question mark, because as I said, most of the activists, they would actually have, and most of them even in Germany, have European passports. So it was not like the typical framing of having no legal framework, but there was something different to it. So, and on the other hand, the critical approaches would also say that statelessness, that we should unmake, Nanny Skuld is saying that we should unmake statelessness as a passive condition, and instead approach statelessness or stateless people and groups as political subjects that have agency. So based on Demirtas' quote and all my, reflections during the research process, I kind of argue that statelessness for the Kurds in Turkey, and even maybe beyond, but this is something that would need some more exploration, of course, not necessarily refers to the lack of a national state, but rather to the dialectical situation of omnipresent states, too many states, in fact, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and at the same time, an omnipresent lack of protection like a lack of non-protection. In my thesis, I call it composite statelessness, where basically Kurdish subjects are desubjectivized and, rendered without protection in the, not just in Turkey, but in the entire field, and that this kind of, in fact, is how statelessness is experienced for the Kurds, to have no reference frame for protection, that their belonging to a regime of rights is always, at disposition, basically. So Kurdish mobilization, Kurdish contemporary mobilization, is not defined by the reproduction of statehood, but in the imaginaries and practices of antithetical character to the dominant ideological political frameworks around the concepts of sovereignty, territoriality, national identity, on which usually, in the classical sense, statehood constitutes its power and legitimacy. And in the thesis, I call this the process of effective externalization of the state. So Kurdish subjects and Kurdish activists, actually, through their experiences with state violence and in omnipresent, multiplicity of statehood that kind of oppresses Kurdish subjects, there has been an effective externalization of the state as like an emancipatory actor. They don't even look at the state as a, at least the activists I talk to, as emancipatory, as an actor of emancipation. So, yeah. So the Kurdish democratic movement in Turkey has, on the one hand, emancipated itself with this kind of, intellectual journey, let's say, because I have not been talking about the origins of the movement, but maybe this is something that we can talk about later. But throughout this whole process of building an arms struggle, then democracy movement, or even in a parallel trajectory, it has, from the very beginning almost, emancipated itself from other left movements, and especially in the Turkish case, from other Turkish left movements, by conceptualizing Kurdish unfreedom, let's say Kurdish unfreedom, as a significantly colonial situation. And Bozarslan, he calls it the autonomization of the Kurdish movement from other left movements. And this was quite at the beginning of the arms struggle. Yet at the same time, and I think this is the interesting part here, it has coined alternative conceptualizations explicitly with the focus of, how to imagine freedom, how to become subjects again in our own lives, and has been advocating, instead of nation building, society building in the past 20 to 30 years. So shifting away its objective from state seeking, the activists call it actually yeni paradigma, so new paradigm. And Joost Jongerden, a very famous scholar, he actually says that in the course of the 21st century, the emphasis on the Kurds as a people without the state became one of the Kurds as a people beyond the state. So I think this is very much important to understand all of the things that I was writing in the articles that you maybe read. But I think this is the baseline. The relation of Kurdish activists who advocate for alternatives, the relation to the state, also the effective relation to the state. So since 2005, advocating for alternative forms of political agency beyond the state and mobilization was always to evade the state both as an object and objective by building grassroots political structures, introducing a new ethos of belonging based on shared values, shared subjugations, and shared norms. And within that process, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, the twin concepts of democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism were actually developed intellectually and also practically in order to make those nation-state borders, the multiplicity of omnipresent states, kind of irrelevant for the everyday interactions within society. So grassroots organization meant organizing society from the smallest unit, even within the family or within like a flat chair, let's say, doesn't have to be a family, and weaving those small units together into like assemblies, council systems, and then also creating somehow a society that is accountable towards each other. Yeah, and then with that also de facto structures of representation, as we have seen, for instance, in the Turkish case, because in the Turkish case, different to the Rojava case, those grassroots mobilizations and grassroots structures have the same starting point and ideological framework, but because of the different contexts they unfold in, they have different articulations. And one of the main things maybe that we should also think about is that these new conceptualizations of belonging and those new norms and the ethos, you know, of society building as like a motivational frame, also always interestingly included feminist reading of liberation. So where not the nation was freed from colonial desires, but self-determination began within the society from the most marginalized, minoritized, and vulnerable units of society. And basically the Kurdish ideological or intellectual journey actually said, okay, you know, who are those groups in society? Women. So freeing women, therefore, has been conceptualized as an anti-colonial struggle, which also adds into the autonomization of the Kurdish movement from other left movements in the region. So anti-coloniality or post-coloniality, which is a complete different trajectory compared to, let's say, to the other movements in the region or histories, the post-colonial imaginary always started with also women as actually the colonized group that has to be liberated first, or that has to liberate itself in order to actually build post-colonial lives. So, and this also has effects on like very, let's say, numeric and basic, let's say, things like, for instance, the number of women mayors in Turkey, you know, how within the last 20 years, I think in total in Turkish history, there were about 150 female women mayors elected, and 70, so half of them were elected in the past 20 years in Kurdish municipalities. So, I mean, not so basic actually, but it has a direct impact on also numeric issues. So it's not just an ideological and intellectual, you know, discourse or deliberation, but it has, you know, physical impact on the lives of the people. So the Kurdish movement intellectually, and this is one of the readings I think that you have, that maybe you have read, understands subordination intertwined. So for the situation of like an unfree Kurdish nation, there is a subordination, intertwined subordination of minorities and women. And this kind of understanding, the diagnostics of the problem, basically, who is actually here oppressed and colonized and subordinated? Well, not only the Kurds, because they are Kurds, but actually all of those people who are minoritized and women also. So this kind of goes beyond the question of national liberation. And one of the famous quotes, and I think, let's say one of my favorite quotes by the founder of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, who has written on all of that I'm now presenting here, the trinity of democratic nation and democratic autonomy and democratic confederalism. Actually, he says, as a diagnostics of the problem, Öcalan says, quote unquote, society treats women as a separate race, nation, or class, the most oppressed race, nation, or class. If we see colonialism not only in terms of nation and country, but also in terms of groups of people, we can define women as the oldest colonized group. It must be well understood that women is kept a colony with no easily identifiable borders. So the question of liberation and emancipation, therefore, also goes beyond the idea of territoriality, right, in this quote, because he says they are not so easily identifiable borders. So we have to actually double check all our interactions and relations towards each other in society to see where, subordination, oppression actually starts, maybe in the gender relations, in order to then free us from those hierarchies within society. And then the prognostic frame, I'm like using those categories from like social movement frame analysis, but, diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational frame. But I mean, we don't have to do it like that, but in order to have a structure. So the prognostic frame would be then to say, well, in order to actually free ourselves from hierarchies and power dynamics, unequal power dynamics, we should desire feminist society building as a form of emancipation from systemic structures of oppression, which are also capitalism, nation statism, and patriarchy. And the interesting thing is that the motivational frame in the Kurdish contemporary mobilization is then to say, basically, freedom will always be incomplete if it's constrained to national borders or to the idea of demarcated territory that we could call our nation state, and that self-organization is actually important for societal survival, especially in hostile environments. And well, I'm coming slowly to an end, but I think what has been really interesting to observe also, like, I mean, I'm a researcher, but I'm also Kurdish, so it was also for me quite, I think most of you who are familiar with the politics in Kurdistan, it was also a very emancipatory moment for all of those of us who are observing that and who were watching it from a very close moment, because the transformative potential of a narrative like this, of narrating the nation beyond the ethno-nationalist confines, actually is very high, because the quest for democracy in Kurdish mobilization, especially in Turkey, but also, as I said, everywhere else, is basically twofold. One, internal. So we have to democratize our relations towards each other. We have to build our relations in society, relations that the state is systematically fracturing in order to, actually become free. And at the same time, in the case of Turkey, we have seen that there are also representative, there are also partaking in representative politics in order to democratize the institutions from inside. And in one of my, I think, articles, I have compared it to Nikos Poulantzas, like the idea that you can actually, the relative autonomy of the state, that you can actually change it from within, And so the transformative potential of actually having the power to change power dynamics and hierarchies from within by changing yourself first has been most significantly seen and articulated in the electoral success of HDP in 2015, of the pro-democratic democracy movement party that was born from the Kurdish movement, and that is actually following all of these ideals that I just presented. And it has also shown, and I'm wrapping up here, that it's still that is still like an asset, the Kurdish vote, and to have like this kind of subjectivity or the subject formation under the Kurdish movement mobilization in Turkey, that is still an asset in electoral politics, where yeah, where basically Kurds are saying, no, you know, we are still, we will still vote for our party. And I actually have some images with me, but maybe I can show them later in the Q&A, where even in the most like despair, like a moment of despair, like last year or 2023 was the election, where it was not very much clear if, you know, the Kurdish party would make it into the parliament or not. Where the oppression was so high, people on the street during like street interviews, they would say, "No, I'm giving my vote to my party," or you know, without even calling it, without even saying HDP, etc. So there is a very strong tie to those emancipatory politics that the Kurdish movement has been establishing inside the society in Kurdistan. And I think this is a transformative potential. I think, you know, democratizing or the quest for democracy does not start or end by turning our heads and eyes to the state that is claiming democracy. But actually, in the Kurdish case, we have been seeing that the quest for democracy starts with the society and with the hierarchical relations within that. The Kurdish movement says we should not be mimicking or imitating from the powerful, like from the state, but we should redefine them in how, yeah, we think that freedom is actually, yeah, should be lived in Kurdistan. So I'm wrapping up here, and I think I spoke, yeah, almost an hour. I don't know, but thank you for your patience and for listening.
Thank you so much. I'm switching the mic back on so you can hear the applause in our rooms. Yes, thank you so much. This was incredibly interesting. And maybe for you, Rosa, and for everyone else in the room, to give you a bit of context where what we read in the reading group before was specifically 2 articles, and you spoke to a lot of elements to it already. The One State, One Nation, One Gender article on the HDP in Turkey and on non-territorial autonomy in Rojava. So, and there are so many interesting things, but I will constrain myself and keep the questions to who else is in the room. So as I said before, we're going to start looking into the chat if there's things written there already. And otherwise, also to everyone else in the room, feel free to then show a hand sign if you want to ask a question directly. So in the chat, of course, now it takes a little while to load.
There's one before that.
Okay. It's okay. I'm going to read it out so that everyone else can hear it, and we will start with this. And as I said, if you can still think of something, feel free to put your hands up, and hopefully we can get to all of them in the meantime. So I'm going to start with the first question by Underjan. You highlighted the multi-locality and diverse socio-historical context of the Kurdish movement. Building on that, I would like to ask about defining historical moments for the Kurdish left. Are there specific figures, events, or narratives that serve as unifying reference points for activists in terms of memory, emotional response, or worldview? How do these shared references manifest across generations and different contexts, such as the diaspora and Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran? And perhaps in what ways do the collective memories of the Kurdish left diverge from those of the broader leftist movement in Turkey? That was quite a lot, so maybe we can start with this and then get to the next set of questions.
Thank you. And it sounds like, you know, like one question that could have come in my PhD defense. So thank you for but we know each other, so it's nice to have you here. Thank you for the question. I think it's a super interesting question. And this is actually one of the chapters, you know, of the thesis, because usually in the literature so far, for instance, events like Nevroz or the resistance in Diyarbakir prison, you know, with Mazlum Doğan, who lit his cell, and, you know, in an act of protest. And then the let's say, the signification of Newroz as a moment of protest is Newroz is the Kurdish New Year, for those who don't know. But I mean, this is, for instance, one of the events that is highly in the literature, analyzed. I think Delal Aydin, for instance, she wrote about Newroz as a myth, and these kind of Kurdish activists have memorized it and have also built identity around those events. But what I found interesting, and which is not very much there yet, is I saw it in Özlem Goner's work on DeZIM, on the DeZIM genocide and the memory of DeZIM, that the descendants of those survivors actually start to have a reference point to Şengal. And this is something that I also observed in my fieldwork, that whenever I spoke to activists, it was interesting that they would kind of memorize and locate themselves in Şengal. And Şengal is in northern Iraq, in southern Kurdistan, but it is a very interesting geography because it kind of brings together parts of Kurdistan. So it has the potential, or let's say the power of imaginary that can be framed as the heart of Kurdistan. And then there is also the minoritized community of the Yazidi people, who are then framed as the basically the origins of the Kurdish nation or the Kurdish people. And then you have the history of 2014, the genocide in Şengal, that has become a reference point for the activists to then say, actually, we are mobilizing because of Şengal or for Şengal, or we see ourselves as Şengali. I have a whole chapter where different activists keep on referring to Şengal as like the root of resistance. So that was very interesting to see that there is a periodic and also generational, let's say, not only transformation but a re-narration of certain sites of struggle and certain histories of struggle that are then memorized in the next generation. So something that was Newroz and Diyarbakir prison for, let's say, some generations is now Şengal. And I found it interesting because what I observed in my empirical material was something that popped up when I was reading Özlem Goner's work on Alevi memory, on memory in the Alevi community, that they make connections to the suffering in Şengal. So there must be some new also timeline, let's say, of new memory making procedures. And similarly, also Rojava has become like this place that symbolizes a lot. And beyond that, actually, there are, I'm sure there are, for instance, there is the Serhildan event in the 90s, the killing of, certain public figures in the 90s that then have led to mass mobilization known as Serhildan, for instance. These are events that kind of are always repetitive in how they memorize and how they remember their own, like the Kurdish history of resistance. I'm not sure if this is something that makes you happy as a response, but you're typing as I see. Let me see. Very interesting. Okay, thank you. But then there were more questions, right? Let me see. So how do they diverge from broader leftist movements in Turkey? Interestingly, I think one of the things that really diverges is the imaginary of territoriality. So how can I say? So the Kurdish movement has, those events in the collective memory that not necessarily have to have like a Kurdistan reference. For instance, I noticed that most of the activists that I spoke to, who they also have like collective memories of motorway blockades and protests in Germany, or they have like collective memories of resistance or protest moments or events with METTV, with the television satellite TV that has its headquarters in Brussels, like close to Brussels. So it doesn't necessarily have to have like a territorial aspect, a national liberation aspect, but as a subversive, resistant moment where Kurdish people kind of protested, has the potential to become like part of a collective memory. But most of the collective memories are actually grievances and not only moments of protest. But in the Turkish left, and also I think in the collective memory and collective imaginary of more or less majority Arab countries, like the Arab uprisings, etc., there is a very strong national narrative in ways, in not national in like an identity as an identity category, but national in, as I call it, the homogeneity paradigm of national and territorial sovereignty. So that has no room for other ideas, because like for other identities, ideas and reference points, because it's interesting that a non-Yazidi Kurdish activist shares a collective memory of a genocide committed against a minoritized community within, the imaginary of Kurdistan, like within Kurdistan. So this is a different form of, self-location and collective memory. So yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Önder.
Thank you so much. That really sounded like it addressed a lot of things. I'm going to read another question that's in the chat so far. There's some more people typing, but yeah, we can keep that going. To the rest of you in the room, feel free to still type, or after we are through the questions in the chat, to put your hand up and to ask live and in person. So a question from Kara. I'm going to read it out loud to the room again. The idea of society building rather than nation building is a beautiful directive, and I believe one which is generation ahead of its time. Of course, Rojava is a prime example. What do you think about the potential vulnerabilities of this approach to hostile agents in such a violent and authoritarian world? Can it be sustained? And might a more traditional nation building approach still be required in parallel?
Shall I? Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Actually, I think this is a very important question, and also something that brings us back to the, to the brutality of what is happening also in Rojava, because the last part is, might a more traditional nation building approach still be required in parallel? I think in real time, it is actually, this is what happens, what we can observe, that there is still this, the ambition to kind of push with the self-determination ideal of the democratic confederalism, society building principles, etc. But in the field of geopolitics, we can observe moments where, for instance, a call for Kurdish unity kind of seems like, I want to emphasize the seems like a contradiction to the ideas of Rojava. For instance, when Mazlum Abdi had his meetings with Masoud Barzani, it was interesting to see, that they wanted to have a stronger, position at the negotiation table when post-Assad Syria is renegotiated in terms of what kind of freedoms and autonomy and what kind of rights will be confiscated again, what kind of situation will be Rojava facing. So it was interesting that, the idea and the call for Kurdish unity was on the agenda. And I don't think this is, in fact, something that contradicts, and I think this is something that is due to the organic structure of geopolitics. So there is always a negotiation in terms of, actors and geopolitical configuration of who is actually where, and sometimes it's also a survival moment where some kind of approaches are more prominent in a moment of time, like in a snapshot on the conflict. But that doesn't mean that the ideals are, put away or not important anymore. In fact, it is always a way to try to broaden the capacities of negotiation, and in order to actually settle more for like the ideals that one pursues. But I see one risk, I have to say, and in the literature that we can also observe that whenever oppression is very high, for instance, in Turkey, when state oppression was super high after 2015, we had like an episode where Kurdish representative politics also were struggling in having, let's say, making the popular bases happy about their decisions. So there was like a contested period where the popular bases were actually critiquing the party leadership, on several issues. Because they would one of the critique was that they would resemble more and more classical parties, and that they would not be anymore, a movement party as they started off. So, and the literature says in moments of state violence that is very high, it's a form of co-optation. So movement parties actually turn into like classical party structures where like hierarchies play a role, where like, careers, maybe positions become more prominent, where survival is at stake. So people do concessions, ideological concessions. So this is something that is not very unusual, and I think this is part of state strategy. And I think because Rojava is Hamid Bozarsan calls it a regime of survival, and I keep citing him everywhere because I think it makes sense to always, keep that in mind, that Rojava is a regime of survival. It's a moment where people are actually fighting for physical and also ideological survival. And in that moment, I see the risk that, there could be also a nationalist backlash within the community that could say, hey, why are we actually so much trying so hard to define freedom in our way? Let's just play the game and let's have, a more Kurdish category or more nationalist category in order to be recognized, let's say. But the problem is, I think, and I mean, this is one risk, but I don't see this coming, to be honest, because I think the Kurdish movement has a very long history and very clear knowledge on the strategies of, the states in co-opting the movement, in also dividing and ruling, and also kind of creating a Kurdish subjectivity. And this is something that the AKP does very, very much. And I was teased, like it was a teaser in my presentation, that they try to create a Kurdish subject that is okay within the frame of the Turkish narration of the nation, like a Muslim, pious, nationalist Kurd, actually, is not very much a problem for the AKP. The emancipatory feminist Kurdish subject is a problem. And this is something that I tried to write in this One Nation, One State, One Gender article, that this was actually the moment where oppression was increased, because this is actually something that challenges the core principles of statehood, because everything else is possible to accommodate. And we can see that even, and to conclude this question, following Turkish media discourse in the course of post-Assad and HTS, etc., that there were like there was this rapprochement of peace talks suddenly. Like the topic turned into, okay, let's have like peace with the PKK. We can do it. AKP, MHP, the nationalist bloc was suddenly talking as if they have never committed war crimes. And then one of I think in one article I noticed that, and then I kept on seeing it more and more in the way they spoke about the Kurds, because they were addressing the issue. They would say, we want to resolve the situation, etc. But they would always say our Kurds. They would never say just Kurds. They would always say our Kurds in Syria, our Kurds in Turkey, our Kurds. So, as I said, they don't, by now, it's not, I mean, it has changed, of course, but by now, it is not just about the denial of Kurdish identity, but about a competition, let's say, about how to frame a Kurdish subject that kind of fits into the nationalist reading of the hegemonic bloc in Turkey. And I see a risk in more, let's say, if the Kurdish movement in Rojava goes, and I don't think this will happen, goes into a more nationalist direction, I see the risk of co-optation from the side of the Turkish side, because I think it kind of feeds into the narrative of our Kurds, where Turkey becomes one of the actors that a classical colonial state, right? So one of the actors that, sorry, I just let someone into the room. One of the actors that provides protection for a Kurdish population, but at the same time has a colonial situation to them, kind of exploits them, oppresses them, and defines who they actually are. And this is right now, in the case of Rojava, in the regime of survival, I think this is at stake. A new colonial relationship between Turkey and the Kurds, where Kurdish identity is not denied anymore, but actually is recognized, but as a colonized identity. I hope that kind of, answered your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Rosa. Again, I think this was again very, very insightful and addressed the question. Yeah, this was sort of the, I don't think there were any more specific questions in the chat, so I would kind of open it up to the room, but we also have, we are in a room of people here, so there are some people here in the room, but maybe first to the online room, and then we can see if there's anyone in the room here who has more questions, and then I can see if there is some more time in the, for everyone else. So is anyone...
One second, sorry, but for some reason I cannot let the person in who's in the waiting room. Maybe you can do that?
I'm trying.
Doesn't work.
I try to admit, but it kind of keeps loading then on them. Frida, do you want to try again? Well, we are in the process of trying. We hope to get that person into the room eventually. While we're waiting for this, is in the meantime anyone who would like to ask a question from the online room right now? Then we can maybe, Jill, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I had a question I wanted to ask. Well, firstly, thank you for coming for the lecture, for the presentation. One thing that I've always had a difficult time understanding about this political model and this way of governance, and also within Rojava as well, is how we understand borders when it comes to this type of governing. Because there is this idea of non-territoriality in a sense, but at the same time, because of the world that Rojava lives in, borders are almost a non-negotiable. So how do the two come together?
No, I think this is a super important question, and I think there is no clear answer to that, because it's embedded in the ongoing, colonization of Kurdistan. But I think you're referring to the NTA model, like non-territorial autonomy, because that idea is that, we can create a nation, a democratic nation or community that not necessarily has to be located within a given territory. So this is already existing in the literature in terms of autonomy struggles. And in that paper, I tried to kind of use that and say, actually the Kurdish case is one of those examples where NTA is realized and practiced. But I would say now, looking back also since then, I would say it's not just practice because it is pursued as an ideal form, but as a mode of survival. I mean, a way to kind of make life work, if that makes sense, to wherever they are. So let's say in my thesis, I also describe it as refugization. So Kurdish people are always pushed away from borders to other borders, and so for instance, the Mahmud community has crossed so many borders. I mean, it's incredible. And at some point, they are being settled in one place in a deserty area, and have to kind of create life from scratch, have to create a community from scratch. And I think the idea of non-territorial autonomy kind of becomes a survival kit. But this is how I kind of contextualize it. It becomes a survival kit that is not only a survival kit for a physical survival, but also ideological survival, to kind of say, okay, we want to create something out of nothing, but not only, it's not just about building a house, let's say a physical house, but also creating something that lasts our physical existence. So ideas and imaginaries and reference points of struggle. But I think compared to, for instance, Rojava, we see that territory becomes a super important topic. I mean, it makes a difference if the SDF are withdrawing from Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, or not. It makes a difference if Turkey is occupying Kobane or Tishrin Dam. I mean, this really makes a difference in terms of, again, the regime of survival. So I think, where at some point, sometimes territoriality is something that is becomes a secondary issue because I think people try to survive. But sometimes those territoriality and borders become the determinant of survival. In the Rojava case. So I wouldn't just, I would always contextualize it, I think. And I don't think there is a clear answer to where territoriality then is in the ideological framework, but I wouldn't say it's a big contradiction, actually. Thank you also for the question, and also Jill for organizing this talk.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks, Rosa, for again answering quite nicely to the point. Do we have anyone else in the room? Otherwise, we have a very eager participant here in the room. Is anyone else first up here who is still raising hands? It doesn't look like. So then, Marshall, do you want to come here so to hear it a bit closer?
Okay. To sit there. Okay, let me use this opportunity to thank you very much for sharing your work and discussing it with our research group. I really appreciate that. So I have two in one question. One would be a bit general, and the other one would be more specific related to your article. The general one would be this issue of the Kurd question and the struggle within the nation state. What, based on your research or based on your work, I don't know whether if you could throw a bit of light into what can you see in terms of commonalities or differences if you want to look at the Kurd question relative to Iraq, Iran, Turkey? Are they of the same are they the same issues that we can talk about in terms of the struggle, or these different nation states, even though you mentioned Syria a bit, whether you could see some differences or there's almost the same in terms of how they have been approached. Then coming to your work, it is quite interesting. You mentioned constitutional reforms. To understand it, knowing the time that it is taking place is also very important. When you were talking about if you look at the 1920s, within 1923, 24, already there was changes. And if you look at 2015 and then all that, you really pointed out how it is important to also look at the context and the particular regime in place when we want to look at constitutional reform and how it has been used as a way to support the regime in place. So, but now the question is also that if we look at these two dynamics and we want to look at it generally, what can you say in terms of the personal idiosyncrasy of the leader at the time and the constitutional development vis-a-vis using it as a tool to promote authoritarianism? Is it more of the national issue, or in your studies you come to see that it is more of the personal idiosyncrasy of the leader? That is what I also want to find out from you in terms with respect to the tech.
Maybe I can even respond to both questions in one go, because I think there is, there is one question of periodization, like the latter one, and the other one is more about territoriality, again, like Iran, Iraq, Syria, etc. And I think there is a common line, although it was like framed as general and more specific, but I think there is, something that I can maybe answer in one answer. So first of all, my research is based on Kurdish, on the Kurdish movement that identifies with the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan and that also organizes around that. So I have not conducted empirical, like a fieldwork in Iraq, or I have conducted fieldwork in Iraq, but not with like non-movement actors or constituencies that are close to the movement, let's say. And I have not been in Iran. But in terms of like looking at those regions, I think there are differences. So I'm not here anyway an expert to say, this is similar or this is different, but I can only speak from my perspective on Kurdistan and then make a comment about that. This is the maximum I can do, but I think there are differences, and one of the reason for the differences is maybe in the way, differences in the way how nationality and nation is imagined. For instance, in Iraqi Kurdistan and or in southern Kurdistan in Iraq or in northern Kurdistan in Turkey is very closely tied to how the state is perceived. So with the activists, that I interviewed, I didn't really go into detail about the effective externalization of the state. But in the narratives, for instance, one activist would say, the way we experienced racialized violence from the Turkish state, for instance, when we migrated to Western cities from Kurdistan, she is an exiled politician, and she was in Izmir. She grew up in Izmir, but they were displaced to that place in the 90s. And then she remembered during the interview, for instance, moments of racialized violence that her family had to endure living in a Western city of Turkey. And it was interesting that in that interview, she said, my father stopped going to pay, stopped making the walk to pay the electricity bill, because that would always entail humiliation from the Turkish bureaucrats who would then, take the bill and then he would pay. But what happened is that the father delegated that role to her mother. So her mother, a Kurdish woman who was not able to speak Turkish, she kind of had to endure the racialized humiliation, the politics of humiliation in the everyday interactions in a Western city. Why am I telling you that? Because it was interesting, because she was a feminist organizer. And she said, the way the state is oppressing us is actually also making gender hierarchies more prevalent within our families. So my mother actually was suffering under like, let's say, patriarchal decision of my father just because he was able to avoid that moment of humiliation. He decided that he would then delegate that moment of humiliation to the woman in the family. And I mean, this was a huge story that she shared with me. I mean, it really took many minutes in the interview. And it made kind of sense to me. So to understand, I mean, the effective externalization, what I mean by that is there is a direct perception of how the state in Turkey actually fractures our social ties to each other, like our relations to each other. This is something that I could see in the Turkish case. I would need to go to Iraq and try to understand how statehood is perceived there, you know. I would need to do interviews in order to understand it. But as a sociologist, I think one of the reasons why the Kurdish movement and the ideas of the Kurdish movement have been flourishing very much in that part of Kurdistan is the assimilationist and non-recognition politics of Turkey, because the Kurdish movement offers a multiplicity of recognition within the movement. It offers a space where Alevi, Yazidi, feminist, non-binary, etc., people can find recognition. So it's a direct, this is why I call it antithetical. It's a direct response to the way violence is experienced. So I would need to go to Iraq and understand how violence is experienced there. Because in the history of Iraq, the oppression of the Kurds is as bad, but it's different. So they were not denied in their existence, but they were recognized and then oppressed, recognized and then massacred. And I think this makes a difference in the sociology of a society. And I think this is also the reason, and this is why I keep on saying context really matters. This is, I think, the reason why also articulations of freedom are different. And to come to the second part in terms of the periodic trajectory, as far as I understood, and I didn't, please correct me if I misunderstood the second part, but I think that this goes hand in hand, what I just said, because if it was the idiocracy of a leader, I don't think the perception of state violence would be as prominent in the memories in the way they are narrated, that I was basically exposed to. So it was never in the interviews. I was actually, because it was very much about narratives and memory, and the activists didn't really speak a lot about Öcalan and his, ideological framework. It was more how they live their lives, how they remember their lives, and how they frame their suffrage and or their grievances and prospects of freedom. So the meta narrative of the movement, basically the meta narrative was not so prominent in the interviews. So I think it's a bit of it has the tendency, when we talk about the Kurdish issue or the Kurdish contemporary mobilization, there is a tendency to kind of reduce it to this idea that there is a movement that kind of follows its leadership, and therefore it kind of survives. But actually, this question was one of the main motivation points of my research, because I thought this cannot be the answer, because otherwise I don't think a movement would survive so many episodes of severe violence across different territories, across the region, and throughout a period of almost 40, 50 years by now. So I think it kind of, it's not, I don't think it satisfies as an answer to say it's the idiocracy of a leader, and this is why mass mobilization is able to take place in this way. I think people are much more complex than that. But thank you for the questions. I really appreciated them.
Okay, thank you so much, Rosa, again. I am aware that we are on the end of the official talk, and we can slightly go over 2 minutes over, and I see that Aaron is still typing, so I'm going to wait quickly if there's maybe still one last question. In the meantime, is there this is your kind of last chance, anyone in the in the online room or here in the room who is still? Okay, perfect. So maybe this is kind of the last one we can kind of like then slowly wrap up with. I actually have 100 questions as well, but I'll take many into a little bit back here. So I'm going to read it quickly to the room again, and hopefully we can then sort of like tie it to, and if that's okay for you, Rosa. Thank you all for organizing, and especially to Rosa for taking the time to speak and presenting her work. I'm wondering, as you talk a lot about violence, especially state violence, how it targets people marked Kurdish, but also many others. I was wondering about violence within the movement or within the NES, possibly against ethnic or religious minorities or against regime opposition. Yes, they're still typing, but maybe we can start with that element.
Well, I mean, I already mentioned that, you know, in moments of very high repression, that there is a tendency of backlash situations. There is a tendency of, like, let's say, copying, practices of colonizers or of the powerful, etc. So there is no basically example in history that is not without contradiction. So I think violence within the autonomous region in northern Syria is an issue that also we need to tackle. But I'm not aware of, let's say, violence against religious minorities or against regime opposition. In fact, I mean, I just want to also highlight that they are how do you call it? Administrating the Al-Hol camp that, you know, has the prisoners, I mean, the ISIS families and prisoners, and there was no violence towards that enemy, you know? I mean, so I'm not sure what Eren, and we know, I mean, we know each other, so I really appreciate the question. I'm not so much sure about whether or not this is, you know, something that was maybe more or less in the news or something, but it happens that in moments of war, of course, violence occurs, even in the most emancipatory movements. But I think, again, we would need to contextualize and would need to understand what actually happened, because I think there is, for instance, the accusation and also the reports that media representatives are not as free as they were a few years ago in order to report on Rojava, or that there are also places with Arab majority populations where the population basically says, you know, the locals say, we feel kind of, we don't want to have, you know, the SDF controlling our region, etc. So there is this contentious moment, of course. But what, I mean, I kind of always differentiate that kind of violence from state violence. I think it has a different conceptual framework and approach. But yeah, this is absolutely an issue and has been an issue also. Thank you for the question, Eren.
Okay, thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you to everyone for coming. I think I'm slowly trying to wrap it up because I'm realizing we're already over time, and then Rosa, you have plans and probably other people here. I have myself so many questions, but I will try to write them in the email because I'm very, very curious. And maybe to wrap it up with regards to our reading group, how we decided, because you talked about so many elements that we discussed, specifically the sort of ambivalences between when we read the two articles. We started with the one state, one nation, one gender about the HDP and the conception of a new national project, but through vis-a-vis women's liberation as kind of transformative, but also then non-territorial autonomy approaches in Rojava and so on. And it's really, I found it amazing how you talked about the role of the state as well, so that it does not start or end with the state, a movement that is not necessarily state-seeking, but things beyond these categorizations with the ambivalences that come with it. And that was very much what we wanted to explore a little bit with this idea of, we started with the very broad concept of left-wing nationalism, but how can those framings and those contexts be rethought in more emancipatory terms and what we could, people who are not concerned maybe in other leftish contexts, learn from those struggles and be allied with. But if there's any no last questions, I think I will try to wrap it up to not basically stretch people's timetables here too much. But I would like to thank you so much again for taking the time to talk to us. It was incredibly insightful. I think I talked with Jill a couple of days ago. I think actually, in addition, this was, I believe, for Demos and Aalborg University, the first time that we had a also Kurdish scholar talking on Kurdish issues here at the university, and I'm very, very glad that we managed to get this done. And yeah, thanks again so much for an incredibly interesting talk, and I believe everyone else will support me in giving you a round of applause there.
Thank you for the invitation. It was really a pleasure, and I hope, I mean, it's a very complex topic, and I hope it was okay to dive in like from here and there, but thank you also for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone else for coming. And yes, you managed to sign up, so we will keep you updated if you're willing to listen to that with further insights from our research group as well, and hopefully further events. So keep an eye out for those things, and feel free to contact us through our various means and channels if you want to know more about the kind of work we do here. Okay, thank you so much again, Rosa, and everyone else. And that's it with our event today. So thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.